I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, tugging once at the hem of my faded jeans, smoothing out the wrinkles on a plain white t-shirt that had seen better days. No makeup worth mentioning. No jewelry. No visible sign of anything extraordinary. To anyone else, I looked like exactly what they expected me to be. Ordinary, forgettable, and slightly worn down by life. And that was the point. Because today, I was attending my ex-husband's wedding. The gold-plated invitation sat on the dresser behind me, catching the light every time I moved. Heavy. Excessive. Designed not to invite, but to remind. Quiet way of saying, look what you lost. Look where we are now. His family had made sure it arrived wrapped in layers of fake politeness and very real condescension. They wanted me there. They wanted me to see him win. They wanted me smalled. I smiled at my reflection. Not soft, not sad. Cold. Controlled. There would be no tears today. Not mine. The only tears shed would belong to the people who once trampled on my dignity and called it fate. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a front row seat to the most chaotic circus they have ever witnessed, and you won't want to miss how this ends. From the other room came the unmistakable sound of chaos. One son arguing with his brother over a missing shoe, the other laughing far too loudly for 8 a.m. I didn't yell. I didn't rush. I listened. Those two sounds, noise and laughter, were reminders of why I survived everything I did. And why today mattered. They weren't just my children. They were proof that I rebuilt something real while others were busy pretending. What no one at that wedding knew, what they never bothered to imagine, was that behind this deliberately modest outfit stood a woman quietly holding a massive fortune. Not inherited, not married into, built, piece by piece, contract by contract. While they were busy rewriting history to paint me as the ex who failed, I was learning how power actually works. This wasn't coincidence. It was camouflage. I had learned long ago that nothing disarms arrogance faster than underestimation. Let them think I came to mourn. Let them whisper about my clothes, my life, my supposed regrets. Every judgment would make what came next even sweeter, so I turned away from the mirror and called for my sons to hurry up. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. This wasn't a woman walking into humiliation. This was a woman walking into a reckoning. And the show was just about to begin. 5 years earlier, long before gold-plated invitations and carefully chosen disguises, my life had been ripped apart on one of the coldest nights Maine had ever seen. I was 7 months pregnant with twins, my hands swollen, my back aching, when Irma Montgomery summoned me into the foyer of their estate. The house was warm, too warm, marble floors gleaming beneath a chandelier that cost more than most people's homes. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place could feel so beautiful and so hostile at the same time. Irma didn't waste words. She never did. She picked up my suitcase, already packed, though I hadn't packed it myself, and hurled it through the front doors, straight into the snow. The doors swung open, and the winter storm rushed in like an animal set free. "You think we don't know?" she said, her voice sharp with disgust. "Twins. As if our bloodline could produce something so common." I stared at her, confused, terrified, one hand instinctively moving to my stomach. She stepped closer, her perfume mixing with the icy air. "You're a gold digger," she continued. "You trapped my son. And now you want to dilute our prestigious bloodline with children that aren't even his." The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. Curtis stood just a few feet away near the staircase. My husband. The man who had sworn to protect me. I looked at him, waiting for him to laugh, to protest, to say this is insane. He didn't. He stared at the floorboards like they held the answers to the universe. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at me. He said nothing. That silence, his cowardly silence, cut deeper than the freezing wind already seeping into my bones. Irma pointed toward the open doors. "Get out." And just like that, I was disposable. I pulled my coat tighter around my body and walked into the blizzard, my breath turning white in the air, my heart breaking with every step away from the life I thought I had. I didn't cry then. Shock doesn't allow for tears. It only allows for survival. I don't know how long I walked before my legs gave out near the highway. What I do know is that Sarah found me and my best friend had been calling all night, worried when I didn't answer. She spotted me shivering on the roadside, half frozen, barely conscious, and she didn't ask questions. She just wrapped me in blankets and took me home. Her apartment was small, loud pipes, thin walls, but it was warm, and for the first time that night I was safe. Sarah stayed with me through everything. The sleepless nights, the fear, the labor that nearly broke me, the postpartum depression that followed. When I cried about the life I lost, she held me. When I raged, she listened. And one night, as I sat on the floor surrounded by baby bottles and overdue bills, she said something that changed everything. "Tears won't pay for diapers, Loretta." It wasn't cruel. It was honest. That was the night I stopped being the naive girl who begged for love and started becoming someone else entirely. While my twins slept, I studied financial markets, balance sheets, debt structures. I learned how money really moved, and more importantly, how it crushed the careless. 5 years passed like that. Quietly, relentlessly, I built a firm from a cramped home office, specializing in distressed debt and non-performing loans. I bought failing business debt for pennies, restructured it, and turned collapse into profit. I hid behind shell corporations, layers deep, making sure no one could trace the deals back to me. I acquired portfolios tied to New England real estate developers, watching the market like a chessboard. And all the while I kept an eye on the Montgomerys. Their finances weren't as invincible as Irma believed. Cracks were forming. Over-leveraged assets, bad loans, arrogant decisions. I didn't rush. Money was the only language people like Irma respected, and I was becoming fluent. I waited patiently, holding my cards close, until the perfect opportunity appeared. Until it was time to close the net. The invitation arrived on an otherwise quiet morning, slid onto my mahogany desk by my secretary with the same care she reserved for legal notices and acquisition contracts. Cream-colored paper. Expensive. The kind of envelope designed to announce importance before it was ever opened. Gold leaf lettering spelled out Curtis Montgomery and Whitney Hale, joined in holy matrimony. I didn't flinch. I didn't scoff. I simply turned the card over. And that's when I saw Irma's handwriting. It was neat, controlled, venomous. She wrote about new beginnings, about a worthy heir, about how Curtis was finally entering a real high society marriage. Then came the final line, the one meant to humiliate. "We thought you should see how things were always meant to be." Irma believed she was rubbing her victory in my face. In reality, she was handing me the key to her destruction. A cold smile spread across my lips as I reached for my phone. Call. Then another. By the time I set it down, my legal team was already moving. Quietly. Efficiently. "It's time," I told them. "Let's collect the debts." Sunday morning arrived wrapped in thick Maine coastal fog. The kind that blurs edges and hides what's really there until it's too late. I pulled out of my driveway in a battered Toyota Camry I'd borrowed from one of my junior analysts. Dented bumper, peeling clear coat, the steering wheel thin and plasticky beneath my palms, and the back seat. Kyle and Kevin argued happily about who would get the better ocean view. Their laughter filled the car, grounding me. This wasn't just theater. This was strategy. As we approached the estate, the Camry was swallowed by a parade of Rolls-Royces and Bentleys, polished to mirror finishes. The contrast was almost comical. I could practically feel eyes judging before anyone even saw my face. The security checkpoint. A uniformed guard stepped forward, his gaze sliding from the dented bumper to my plain white t-shirt with open disdain. "You're at the wrong entrance," he said flatly. "Catering goes around back." I met his stare without blinking and calmly handed him the gold-embossed invitation. His brow furrowed. He flipped it over. Then again. Expensive paper. Impeccable engraving. A name that clearly didn't belong to someone driving this car. "Please check your guest list again," I said evenly. "My name is Loretta." He typed again. Then his expression shifted. Confusion edged with irritation. Reluctantly, he waved us through. As the gate opened, his sneer followed us, sharp and unashamed. I smiled to myself. Every assumption confirmed the disguise was working perfectly. I parked far from the main area, in a remote corner of the lot where no one could box us in. "Always plan your exit." The gardens were immaculate. Manicured hedges, white roses everywhere, the ceremony moments from starting. Guests stood in clusters, crystal champagne flutes catching the gray light, jewelry flashing with every movement. Necklaces that probably cost more than college tuition. Watches that screamed generational wealth. Conversations died as we walked past. First a few glances, then whispers. Women raised gloved hands to their mouths. Men frowned openly, confused by my presence, my children, my clothes. Casual enough for a grocery run, let alone a high society wedding. Who allowed the riffraff? Their eyes seemed to ask. I held my head high and kept walking. Rows of white folding chairs faced a flower-covered altar overlooking the Atlantic, the ocean restless and steel-colored behind it. I knelt in front of my sons, straightened their collars, smoothed their hair. Their eyes sparkled with mischief. "Do you remember the pirate game?" I whispered. They nodded eagerly. "This entire garden is the treasure map," I continued softly. "And you're allowed to break all the rules today. Run and find the gold. Right now." They grinned and took off as I stood. The fog began to lift, and with it, the illusion the Montgomerys had spent years protecting. The storm hadn't arrived yet. But it was coming. Exactly 11 o'clock noon. The violins began. The first long, elegant note floated across the garden, signaling that the ceremony was officially starting. Conversations hushed. Guests straightened in their seats. Heads turned toward the heavy oak doors at the far end of the aisle. They opened slowly. Whitney appeared, framed by light, a porcelain doll encased in layers of expensive lace and silk. Her smile was radiant, practiced, flawless. She drank in the admiring gazes, completely unaware that two small hurricanes were about to tear her perfect moment to shreds from my seat near the back. I gave the smallest nod. Kyle and Kevin launched forward like two arrows released from a bow. Shrieks of pure, unfiltered childish delight echoed off the stone walls as they tore through the rows of seated guests. Expensive suits were tagged by sticky fingers. Outstretched legs were dodged at the last second. Gasps rippled through the crowd as sacred space turned into a public playground. An elderly woman clutched her pearl necklace as one of the boys darted past. A towering floral arrangement tipped and crashed to the ground, petals scattering like confetti. The violins faltered, then stopped entirely. Then Kyle saw it. The champagne tower stood near the front. Hundreds of crystal flutes stacked in a shimmering pyramid, catching the light like a monument to excess. I recognized the mischievous glint in his eyes instantly. The same one he wore before every forbidden adventure. He clipped the table leg on purpose. For one suspended heartbeat, the structure wobbled violently, glass trembling against glass. Then the entire tower collapsed in spectacular fashion. The sound was deafening. Hundreds of crystal glasses shattering simultaneously, followed by collective screaming. Champagne exploded outward, drenching the front rows in sticky, sparkling wine. Dresses clung. Hair plastered to faces. Men jumped to their feet, shouting in disbelief. Irma sprang up from her seat of honor. Her face flushed a deep, furious crimson that clashed horribly with her silver dress. Veins bulged along her neck as she stared at the ruin of her meticulously planned event. Her mind clearly unable to comprehend what she was seeing, she pointed a shaking finger at my laughing sons. "Get them out!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "Security! Drag these uneducated brats out. They're ruining the most important day in my family's history." Curtis had gone pale from the altar. His eyes darted between the chaos and his mother's meltdown. The bride stood frozen mid-aisle, bouquet trembling in her hands, horror etched into every line of her face. Curtis stepped down from the stage, panic tightening his jaw, and strode toward Kevin. He reached out aggressively, fingers inches from my son's collar. Then Kevin looked up wide, fearful eyes met Curtis's. Eyes that mirrored the exact shape and unmistakable color of his own. Curtis froze as if struck by lightning. His hand hovered uselessly in the air, his brain visibly struggling to process the impossible familiarity. He leaned closer, studying Kevin's face. The jawline, the nose, the distinctive way his eyebrows arched, features he saw in the mirror every single day of his life. Who do you belong to?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Kevin swallowed hard. Curtis's breath hitched. Why do you have my eyes? His gaze flicked over the boy's face again, desperate now. Why does looking at you feel like looking at a ghost? The murmuring stopped. Every guest sensed it at the same moment. This was no longer about broken glass or bad behavior. Something far more scandalous was unfolding in front of senators, CEOs, and socialites alike. That was my cue. I stood slowly from the back row, smoothing my simple white t-shirt, my movements unhurried. I stepped into the center aisle and began to walk forward, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone path. Each step felt like reclaiming stolen ground. I stopped a few feet from Curtis. The color drained from his face as his gaze lifted from my son to me. I met his eyes calmly and spoke loud and clear, my voice cutting through the stunned silence so every powerful person present could hear. Are you really planning to use violence on your own son on your wedding day? Gasps rippled through the crowd. I tilted my head slightly, letting the words land. Or is that just the traditional way the Montgomery family welcomes its own flesh and blood? Silence crashed down heavier than any shattered glass. Hundreds of eyes darted between me, the frozen groom, and the living proof standing trembling between us. A secret that, in that single moment, threatened to destroy an entire dynasty. For a moment, no one moved. The silence after my accusation was deadly, thick, suffocating. My sons whimpered softly behind Curtis, their small sounds cutting through the stillness like a blade. Somewhere in the crowd, a camera shutter clicked. Then another. Phones were already raised. Everyone present could feel it. This was becoming the scandal of the decade. Irma knew it too. She broke first with trembling hands. She smoothed the front of her silver dress, forcing a brittle plastic smile onto her face as she turned toward the guests. Silence for her meant an irreversible end, and she had spent her entire life controlling narratives. This woman, she announced sharply, pointing a manicured finger straight at me, is a lying gold digger who cannot stand to see her replacement happy. Her voice rose to a shrill pitch, desperation leaking through every syllable. She's hired these children from some agency to ruin our honor and extort money from my son. That's all this is. A pathetic attempt to destroy us. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Irma seized on them, mistaking uncertainty for belief. I didn't argue. There was no point debating someone drowning in delusion. I had come prepared with something far more powerful than empty words. I reached into my worn leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was heavy, not just with paper, but with years of patience. Inside were the paternity test results, commissioned quietly long ago, using hair taken from Curtis's old brush back when I still lived in that house. I had kept them for years. I walked past Curtis, who still hadn't moved. His eyes locked on my boys as if they might vanish if he blinked. I stopped at the altar, directly in front of Whitney. She stood there like a marble statue, veil forgotten, bouquet limp in her hands. I didn't hand her the envelope gently. I tossed it at the hem of her designer wedding gown. It landed with a dull thud that sounded like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict. Look closely at that paper, I said calmly, before you make the biggest mistake of your life. I tilted my head toward Curtis. Ask yourself if you really want to marry a coward who denied his own biological children just to keep his inheritance intact. Whitney stared at the envelope for a long, agonizing moment. Fear battled curiosity, and lost with shaking hands, she bent down, tore open the seal, and began to read. Her eyes widened. The numbers stared back at her in black and white. 99.9% probability of paternity. The color drained from her face as realization crashed in. The perfect bachelor narrative. The carefully curated image. All of it fabricated. A lie designed to secure her father's political connections and her inheritance. She looked up at Curtis, really seeing him for the first time. Not a groom. A spineless liar who had hidden a massive part of his life to get his hands on her future. The fire that ignited in Whitney's eyes burned hotter than the midday sun. Shock turned into blind rage. She ripped the massive diamond engagement ring from her finger, scratching her skin in the process, and hurled it directly into Curtis's face with every ounce of strength she had. The ring struck his cheekbone with a sharp crack, splitting skin. Blood bloomed instantly. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the blow to his carefully constructed life. Whitney stepped forward and swung her hand in a wide arc. The slap was thunderous. It echoed across the garden and was captured by every smartphone camera in the vicinity. "You people are a bunch of sick liars," she shouted, her voice shaking with fury. "You would say anything to trap me in your web." She gestured violently at Irma, then Curtis. "I would rather die alone and old than step foot into this deceitful family." She turned toward the stunned officiant and the watching crowd. "The wedding is cancelled." She didn't wait for explanations. Didn't listen to apologies. Anything coming out of Curtis's mouth would have been just another lie. Gathering the heavy layers of silk in her hands, Whitney turned on her heel and sprinted back up the aisle, sobbing uncontrollably as she fled the scene of her humiliation. Guests parted like the Red Sea, silently letting the runaway bride pass behind her. The Montgomery family stood alone in the wreckage of their reputation. Amid shattered glass and spilled champagne, Curtis remained frozen near the altar, a bright red handprint burning across his face, blood trickling down his cheek. He looked like a man watching his entire future slip through his fingers. Irma collapsed into her chair, clutching her chest in a theatrical display of distress, and no one rushed to comfort her. For the first time in her life, she had nothing left to command. 2 days after the wedding disaster, I sat at the head of a long mahogany table on the top floor of a city center commercial building, watching the skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass. The room was silent, cold, almost sterile, exactly how I wanted it. A high-backed leather chair supported my shoulders as I waited, hands folded calmly in front of me. The door opened. Irma entered first, Curtis trailing behind her. They walked in wearing the same familiar armor of arrogance, as if nothing fundamental had shifted, as if the world hadn't cracked beneath their feet 48 hours earlier. Irma scanned the room with critical eyes, lips pursed, clearly assuming I had rented the space by the hour to look important. She sat opposite me without invitation. Curtis avoided my eyes, but his posture still carried entitlement. In their minds, this was a negotiation. Child support. Nuisance. A desperate attempt by a discarded woman to extract money. They had no idea they were sitting in a lion's den. Irma wasted no time. She snapped open her designer handbag, already irritated, eager to close this humiliating chapter and return to damage control for her reputation. She pulled out a checkbook and scribbled aggressively, the pen carving deep grooves into the paper. She tore the check free and flicked it across the polished table. It slid to a stop directly in front of my hands. $10,000, paltry amount. Not even enough to cover one of my firm's celebration dinners. Irma leaned back, satisfied, looking at me the way aristocrats look at beggars. "Take this and get out of our lives forever," she said coolly. "Hand over custody of the children immediately. They need a noble environment, not whatever squalor you're living in." I didn't touch the check. Anger had no place here. That time had passed years ago. That precise moment, the heavy oak doors opened again while lawyer David walked in carrying a leather briefcase. His bespoke suit cost more than Curtis's car, and his confident stride commanded immediate respect. He placed several files on the table with deliberate calm, then glanced at the check with faint amusement, using the tip of his pen. He slid it back toward Irma. It fell off the table and landed at her feet. The disrespect was calculated. "Surgical. Perhaps," David said evenly. "You have made a serious mistake. My client earns this amount in a single hour. She has no interest in your charity." Irma and Curtis stared, mouths slightly open, trying to process the absurdity of what they had just heard. David didn't give them time to recover. He pressed a button on a remote. The lights dimmed. A projection screen descended from the ceiling, humming softly as it came to life. The logo appeared first. Iris Capital. Then charts, flow diagrams, acquisition trails. I watched recognition creep slowly across Irma's face as familiar names appeared. Family businesses, shell companies, estate holdings, all listed neatly under acquired assets, David narrated calmly. Every mortgage, every business loan, every line of credit they had taken out over the last decade to fund their lifestyle. Purchased. Consolidated. Owned by me. The color drained from Irma's rouged cheeks, leaving a sickly pallor. Her eyes flicked from the screen to my face, horror dawning as the final dots connected. The ruthless investment firm. The discarded daughter-in-law. The woman she thought was on food stamps was holding the leash around her neck. I stood and walked to the screen, placing my hand on a graph labeled imminent insolvency. "Do you really think I need your money, Irma?" I asked quietly. "Look at the screen and understand. The one drowning in debt, about to be thrown onto the street, isn't me." I turned back to them. "It's you. And your son." Silence crushed the room. Mother and son sat paralyzed, finally understanding they were no longer masters of their fate. 30 minutes later, the air had become suffocating. Curtis's breathing was shallow and fast. David finished arranging the final stack of documents. He explained every violation. Curtis using corporate funds to pay for the wedding. A direct breach of loan covenants. Iris Capital had legally triggered the acceleration clause. Every cent was now due. Immediately. They didn't have millions sitting in accounts. I did. David slid the legal notices across the table, one by one. Foreclosure on the Bar Harbor estate had already commenced. Bank accounts were frozen. Luxury vehicles seized pending auction. Irma gasped like a woman drowning. "This is our heritage," she protested weakly. "It has to count for something." David didn't blink. "In finance, heritage doesn't pay bills." Then came the final document. Point one sheet. Heavier than everything before it. Curtis's misuse of funds constituted federal bank fraud and embezzlement. Enough evidence to send him to prison for at least 10 years. Curtis began to hyperventilate. I leaned forward. "There is one way out," I said. "Two choices. Sign this and walk out free, but with empty hands. Or don't sign it, and prepare to trade your suits for an orange jumpsuit." The paper was a voluntary termination of parental rights. Permanent. Curtis stared at the pen, hand shaking violently. He looked at me with pleading eyes, searching for the woman who once loved him. He found only ice. "I'll sign," he choked. "I don't want to go to jail." He didn't hesitate. He signed. Irma lunged forward screaming, but it was too late. I snatched the paper the moment the ink dried, verified the signature, and handed it to David. The disgust I felt was absolute. I pressed the intercom. "Security. Escort the trespassers out of my property." Their protests echoed down the hallway as they were dragged away. When the doors closed, the silence that followed marked the true end of the Montgomery curse on my life. 1 month later, life had settled into a quiet rhythm again. Not the fragile quiet of fear, but the steady peace that comes after a storm has burned itself out. The legal chaos was over. The paperwork finalized. And while my world returned to its natural, peaceful trajectory, the world of the people who tried to destroy me had completely collapsed. News of the Montgomery bankruptcy spread through the same social circles that once worshipped them, shattering an illusion of prestige they had spent decades carefully maintaining. Irma fell first, and hardest. Within a week, the Bar Harbor estate was seized. I was told she stood stiffly in the driveway as strangers catalogued and auctioned off antique furniture, heirlooms, silverware engraved with family crests. Everything she once claimed proved her superiority. All of it sold to pay a fraction of the debt she had accumulated through arrogance and excess. When the house was finally cleared, she was evicted without ceremony from the only home she had ever known. Irma was relocated to a dilapidated social housing apartment on the outskirts of the city. Peeling paint, flickering lights, heat that barely worked in winter. The stress triggered a mild stroke not long after, leaving her partially paralyzed on one side and struggling to speak clearly. She now spends her days sitting alone in a wheelchair by a dirty window, staring out at a parking lot instead of an ocean. Trapped in a prison of silence and bitterness. No visitors, no admirers, only a state-appointed nurse who treats her with professional indifference. The woman who once ruled rooms with fear and money now commands nothing at all. Curtis did not fare much better. With his reputation destroyed and his financial crimes quietly buried but widely whispered about, he became unemployable in the only world he had ever known. No bank would touch him. No firm would risk the association. Eventually, he took a job as a sales assistant in a discount shoe store at a shopping mall, a position he would have mocked mercilessly just months earlier. Former friends walked past the storefront without acknowledging him, eyes sliding away in practiced discomfort. He lived in a constant state of regret. His punishment not dramatic, but relentless. Every day, reminders of what he had lost, sometimes at a newsstand near the mall. He would see my face smiling confidently from the cover of major business magazines. Articles praising strategic brilliance, quiet resilience, success built from nothing. And with each glimpse, the truth cut deeper. He had traded a loving family and a brilliant future for a lifetime of servitude and loneliness, because he was too cowardly to stand up to his mother. While they lived inside the consequences of their greed, my sons and I moved forward. We settled into a beautiful villa overlooking the ocean. A home bought with honest money and filled with genuine laughter. Kyle and Kevin adjusted remarkably well, thriving in an environment where they were encouraged to be themselves rather than molded into heirs for a dying dynasty. I often watched them chase each other through the garden, laughing with the same innocent joy they had shown on that wedding day. They never once asked about their father. That was when I knew I had made the right choice. Our life was built on transparency, safety, and unconditional support. My boys would grow into strong men who understood the value of integrity and respect, not entitlement and cruelty. One evening, sitting on the terrace with a glass of wine, watching the horizon melt into the sea, I thought back to the promise I made to myself 5 years earlier in a blizzard. I didn't need their apology. An apology from a narcissist is just another form of manipulation. And I certainly didn't need their forgiveness. I severed ties completely, not out of cruelty, but out of fierce necessity, to protect the future of my children from the toxic poison of the past. The victory was never in their destruction. It was in my liberation. A woman pushed to the edge can either fall or learn to fly, and I chose to soar. There are lessons in this story worth remembering. True power comes from self-reliance. When you build your own throne, no one can ever knock you off it. I rebuilt my life without begging, without depending on anyone, and without waiting for permission. Never judge someone by appearances. The Montgomerys saw faded jeans and an old car and assumed weakness. Real strength often moves in silence. Those who rely on appearances are always the first to collapse when the storm hits. And finally, family is chosen. It isn't defined by blood or a shared last name, but by who stays, loves you, and respects you. Curtis may have been a biological father, but biology alone never made him a dad. Parenthood is not a right. It's a privilege earned through actions every single day. Thank you for staying with Loretta's journey of redemption and justice until the very end. Now tell me, would you have signed that paper? Or would you have given him a second chance for the sake of the kids? I read every single comment. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next dramatic story.